You're gonna love this, okay? The IRA have become so well known that Marvel signed them up. Yes, children's comic books, Marvel signed them up. So yeah, before Thanos, we had the IRA. I mean, Jesus, look at this. Spider-Man is fighting the IRA in the north of Ireland. So he's fighting them on their home turf. There's something a bit strange about an American superhero working with British forces to thwart Irish people in their own country. A little bit strange. Now, I will do a longer video on this another time, but suffice to say, Nick Fury will not be calling us into the Avengers anytime soon. Look at this. This is bananas. I mean, look what's going on here. In fact, you know what? Some of the Marvel characters were so involved with the IRA that they sometimes got confused for being in the IRA.
Well, if you ask me, am I a member of the IRA? No, I'm not. Was I a member of the IRA? No, I wasn't.
13 gone and not forgotten. We got 18.
Oh my god. Look, moral of the story, boys and girls. Don't get your Irish history from Hollywood movies, and certainly don't get your Irish history from Marvel Comics. So look, there you go, okay? And unless you didn't get the memo, Marvel Comics, IRA, come on in, baby. We're all waiting for you. Other Hollywood movies? Why not? Come on, bring them on in, baby. James Bond series? Not tonight, lads. Not a chance. And that's the answer, basically. It's 2025, and Ireland has still not joined the James Bond cinematic universe fully. Or ever. And if you think about it, it makes sense. I mean, James Bond fights terrorists. He protects Queen and Country. I mean, he protects everything under Her Majesty's realm. And Ireland from about 1916 to about 2006, we just produced terror. Big question I hear everyone asking right now. Can Ireland ever join the James Bond universe? Well, no. And the reason should be pretty obvious from this video. I mean, the overriding consensus on Reddit, of all places, is basically if you do a James Bond movie and you do the IRA, you will be blown up. And that was kind of the reason hushed in, school playgrounds, pubs, whatever around Ireland. Now, do I think that would have happened? Yes, I do think that would have happened. I mean, the IRA blew up everything else. It wouldn't be too hard for them to blow up the studio where James Bond was being filmed. Now, Amazon does own the rights to James Bond these days, so I do think they probably could do an Irish plotline. Wouldn't be a great idea, but the Broccoli's are gone now, so any sort of tact and measured response is now out the window. I mean, there's even talk about Pierce Brosnan coming back, and he always wants to do an Irish-centric plot. So, God help us all. But yeah, look, do I think if they did that, it would reignite a war, or the IRA would come back with a vengeance? No, I think that time has passed. I mean, very famously, Brexit almost caused a hard border to return in Northern Ireland, and not even that caused the IRA to resurface in any significant way. So if that didn't do it, I can't see Pierce Brosnan doing it. Now, let's just park all that aside, okay? So that's the usual response to a James Bond movie in Ireland, is that, people just start getting blown up, okay? A far more relevant one, in my opinion, is it morally right to do a James Bond movie set and centered around Ireland? Indeed, is it right for Hollywood to make any sort of a profit off such a movie? And whatever way you look at it, it would definitely stir up emotion from both sides, whether intentionally or not. And in my opinion, it would trivialize and make light of a situation, making something visible which was never fully visible in the series beforehand. I mean, just sit down there now and try and write a James Bond plot involving the Irish government, the IRA, all those other factions that I mentioned, and all those other factors that I mentioned. Here's a challenge: try not to piss anyone off. So you can't, and that's the dilemma that the James Bond producers came to as well. And I do think that the erasure of Ireland from these movies operates on much the same principle. Not naming Ireland is perceived to be good because of past history. However, its absence can also be perceived as bad, for it gives no voice to a former colony whose real-life struggle was also being ignored by the UK in a non-fictional capacity. Indeed, because of the James Bond series, the history between Ireland and Britain is now gone, and it does remove any sort of accountability that the British government had towards the situation in the north, ironically, creating a legacy far greater than the movies themselves. Had the James Bond movies been the only surviving documentation of history post-World War II, one could definitely get broad strokes of what had happened and what the current political and geopolitical situation is. However, regarding Ireland, you get no idea. In fact, as I state throughout this video, apart from a few nods here and there, it simply does not exist. Its history and its people erased. The world of academia has also noticed the geopolitical situation that the James Bond movies mirror. However, they're somewhat silent, mostly silent, on the absence of Ireland in these discussions related to James Bond. Now, plenty of studies do note that the James Bond franchise has consistently reflected and responded to the political climate of its time. And they all certainly mention that during the Cold War, Bond films reflected Western perspectives on global conflicts. And they've listed many examples here of the movies relating to real-world events. And they also make note that as Britain's influence declined in the real world, the films did explore this diminished global role. But unfortunately, when it comes to Ireland, my country's absence in these same papers and studies would tell a story that academia also seems to suffer from the same erasure that the Broccolis and the James Bond series seemed keen to allow persist. And so I hope this video in some small way fills that gap. And I think this is quite ironic and telling in a movie series about a character who could be seen as preserving the interests of Her Majesty's Empire. And so the James Bond movies appear to have done something so profound that not even the real MI5 or MI6 could achieve. They got rid of the Irish. For the record, here are all the James Bond movies. Now, let's have a look at them. Let's bask in their glory. And, well, look, here's the one set in Ireland. Okay, we'll try that again. Here's the ones that have the Irish mentioned, at least. Okay. Well, how about the ones where Ireland just appears in the background on the map? Or that one time in Skyfall where Mallory is mentioned as being held hostage by the IRA. You see, that's it, really. And that was in 2012. That was 16 years after the peace process. 7 years, actually, after the IRA disbanded. It was safe to do it then, but it wasn't safe before to do it. And the point of this video will be to show you why it was not safe for the Bond producers to ever mention Ireland in the movies beforehand. Now, as I mentioned just there, we do appear on the maps. It would be pretty stupid to try and erase a whole country from the map, but by God, they still tried. Yes, we're gone, erased, probably killed by James Bond himself on Her Majesty's Secret Service, no doubt. Still not convinced? Well, come on, I'll explain. Now, maybe it was just me, but when Pierce joined the franchise, I, naively as a young boy, well, I had high hopes of a dream I've had since watching the Bond movies all the way back since I was a child, and that dream was that Bond would go to Ireland. Now, given what the movies eventually turned out to be, it was a bit of a pipe dream, and all we really got out of Pierce Brosnan was 4 Bond movies, none of which had anything to do with Ireland. Now, we did start off with the amazing GoldenEye, and then unfortunately we ended on a bit of a whimper, some might say, killing the franchise with Die Another Day, presumably that day being 2 months later when the box office closed. Now, unfortunately, as I mentioned, none of Brosnan's Bonds ever saw him go to Ireland. In fact, Pierce Brosnan once tried and failed to get them to film here. It just wasn't meant to be. Now, I will say at the outset here, we're not the only country that got shafted. So Australia is also neglected, and Australia and Ireland are both former colonies of the UK, and we're both missing from the movies. And even though Australia won't be mentioned too much in this video, I thought I'd give my Australian brothers a quick mention there. Funnily enough, the only 2 links between the 2 countries is James Bond himself. Because not only was Pierce Brosnan Irish, but George Lazenby was Australian. So that's all we're good for. So it turns out we don't get to be in the movies, but we do get to be James Bond. So I suppose that's a good trade-off. Now, I will say the Irish one is actually a tragedy. I mean, look at this. When you go to Ireland, of course, you have to do an IRA plot. I mean, they can't even separate us from the terrorists. Even when Bond was planning to go to Ireland, we still have to shoehorn in the IRA. And that's because everyone in Ireland is in Hamas. Oh, sorry, the IRA. Sorry, I got my British foreign policies mixed up there. Basically, don't mention the war. And certainly don't mention the Irish either In fact, don't mention Ireland at all. Yes, unfortunately, Ireland has the same status as Atlantis in the James Bond universe, often whispered in the background, but never seen fully. I mean, collectively, the James Bond universe, including the books and the movies, that's going to stretch us from the late 1940s right up till the modern era. And as I noted, that's a long period of history, and it's an even longer period of history when your own country doesn't even get a mention in the most famous movie franchise of all time. I mean, it's not as if we're miles away from one another, and it's also not as if we have no history with each other. I mean, there's plenty of time, ample time, to do an Irish storyline, something about Ireland, anything. But they didn't, and they probably won't, and they definitely shouldn't, given what I'm about to talk about in this video. Remember what I said about poking the bear? Well, my friends, Ireland is a particular bear all unto itself. Yes, you definitely don't want to poke that bear. And apart from Pierce Brosnan, there's nothing actually particularly Irish about any of the James Bond movies. Not that there should be, technically, but in terms of actors, Pierce Brosnan is kind of the only Irish actor in the movies. In 60 years, one person was Irish. Well, sorry, that's a lie. There was two people. Ladies and gentlemen, Alison Doody. That's a bit mad, isn't it? That, Irish actors, famous around the world, Oscar-winning actors. But good luck trying to get into James Bond movies. But don't worry, folks. They did us proud in the books. No, not those books. Yes, the fan books. And of course, we get our day out in the 2011 Bond novel Carte Blanche, where Jeffrey Deaver writes a character called the Irishman, or less impressively, Niall Dunn. Now, a quick look at my main academic source for all of my videos and research, Wikipedia. It's going to tell us that apart from Pierce Brosnan and Alison Doody, and of course that great fan novel, there really isn't anything else connecting Ireland to these movies. Now, there is one particular Irish reference in the James Bond universe in the literary world. Yes, that's right, everyone's screaming at the screen. The character of Red Grant, played by Robert Shaw in the movies, he's Irish in From Russia with Love, the book version, and he's an ex-IRA man. And his ties to Smersh, and that's really the only time you have either the Irish or the IRA mentioned by Ian Fleming in the main James Bond series. Now, there was another time in Diamonds Are Forever, Brass Leprechauns, hilarious. Thank you, Ian Fleming, sir. Now, you could mention the IRA in your James Bond universe, but as I will show in this video, once the troubles kick off, that's it for Ireland and the IRA. No more. Now, I think it's important to mention the book version there at the outset, because there will be differences between the books and the movies, and sometimes these are massive differences. And people will say, well, the book came out in this time period long before the issue in the north of Ireland you're talking about. That's very true, but ultimately the movies are very lightly based on the books, and most of the time the main plot lines are just completely different, and they usually follow whatever is going on in the world at the time. And when we get to it eventually, you will see that there's a lot going on between Ireland and Britain that gets very much glossed over, ignoring the elephant in the room. Now, we have to get these mentions in here. Look at this, okay? You get to be in the Irish James Bond article if your grandfather emigrated from Ireland. So that's Sean Connery. He's Irish, apparently. And you may not realise this, but another Irishman was James Bond, and that Irishman is Timothy Dalton. And he fishes here. And of course, that's how Irish heritage works, is that you just start fishing in a river and suddenly you're from here. Another way of approaching all this is that it's just fantasy. James Bond is not set in our world, so Ireland's absence is just normal. Nothing happened, blah blah blah, whatever excuse you want to make up. I mean, you could do that. It's not as if the movies don't mention any other real world locations or real world events. Oh, that's right, they do. Now, before we delve deeper into the Irish issue, we must first establish a timeline of events within the Bond universe relating to actual geopolitical events and actual geographical locations. And this is obviously going to help us establish that James Bond operates more or less in our world, the real world. And obviously this is going to help make the absence of Ireland all the more baffling. Now, right off the bat, the most obvious thing, he's a British secret agent. So that means Britain is real. He's also on Her Majesty's Secret Service, so that's the Empire. And you can't have an empire without your colonies. Yes, all the colonies, both past and present, they're all here. Well, except you. And you. And, oh god, get out of here quick. Now, for anyone who watched these movies, it's quite obvious that they're all set post-World War II and post-Korean War, both of which are name-checked in the movies, so that's the 1950s onwards that the James Bond universe exists in. And for whatever weird time travel shite the movies don't focus on, 007 has been fighting the good fight since about 1950, right up until around 2021. So, he's a vampire, I guess. I mean, he is a bit of a leech. Sorry, a lech. I meant a lech. Now, of course, the main war during this period was the Cold War. So that means the Soviet Union and all their apparatus is here. And any smaller Cold War skirmishes that come along are also here too. And of course, the presence of the Cold War means that NATO and the UN are here too. And both of them are name-checked in the movies. Now, I promised I would return to this. There is a bit of a technicality when it comes to the bad guys. The Soviets are the bad guys, but Spectre is technically the bad guys in the James Bond movies. As the Bond movies go on, there is this back and forth between the Soviets just being antagonistic and then becoming reluctant allies, and I'm going to mention them as I go along. But yeah, of course, the Bond movies do substitute various fake nations for real nations and fake organizations for actual organizations. Again, this is done so as not to poke that bear and not to cause any sort of international incidents. Most people lived in fear of nuclear annihilation during this time. No one wants to see their country become the bad guys. And you can kind of see why the James Bond movies never sort of edged themselves into that area of, hey, let's just start nuclear war by just portraying the Soviets as outright bastards, I suppose. Now, it doesn't mean that they didn't try, because obviously James Bond is set in the real world, so they can't just have them ignore the Cold War and the Soviets. And sometimes there's concessions made for this, so you could just say, well, it's not the Soviets this time, it's a rogue colonel in the Soviet Union who went against the KGB's orders, blah blah blah. If you look a little deeper, it's quite obvious that the Soviets are still playing the bad guy role that they played in real life. Now, there was obviously tensions during the James Bond series, especially given that most of the series came out during the Cold War. And I think that tension is perfectly portrayed in the James Bond movies. And a lot of the organizations are name-checked. We have Schmersh. We also have the KGB, the CIA. So yeah, let's just jump in now and just have a look at all the James Bond movies during this time period. And let's just have a look at what was going on outside of the movies and see if there's any overlap between the two. I'm going to timeline these in relation to the Troubles in the North. So in relation to that timeline, obviously the years leading up to the Troubles, the early 60s, that coincides with From Russia with Love. And that's the second Bond movie. And in terms of the wider geopolitical world, it does capture the East-West tensions at the time, and the plot actually does echo real-world issues such as the stealing of a Lecter decoding device from the Soviet Union. And the film does of course actually mirror the real-world espionage battles between Britain and the USSR, with of course America looming somewhere there in the background. Always looming, always there. And this setting up of the Soviets as the, antagonists, bad guys, whatever, this would just become the template right up until the late 80s in the James Bond movie series. And although the movies do portray the tensions, they also do reflect the era's somewhat diplomatic ties that the Soviet Union had with Britain and America at that time. If we just fast forward ahead, The Spy Who Loved Me is a great example of this, and we do see cooperation between the two superpowers. And when that movie came out, there was a significant shift at that time that things could be good between Britain and the Soviets in real life. And if things are good in real life, well, that just means things can be good in the movies too. And just like in real life, things can fall apart pretty quickly too. And of course, that's reflected in the 1983 movie Octopussy, which I'm sad to say is not about a woman with 8 vaginas, which is very strange given James Bond's character. Now, that movie does present us with a rogue Soviet general plotting military aggression. So again, we have a James Bond plot about the Soviets looking to start trouble again. and that's mirroring real-life fears of Soviet expansionism. We also had the famous space race between the US and the USSR, and that's mirrored somewhat in Moonraker and You Only Live Twice. And even when the Soviets aren't particularly involved in those plots, it's quite obvious there's something going on in the background, and it's not good. Now, the 1973 oil crisis. You could say that's somewhere there in the makeup of The Man with the Golden Gun. That came out in 74. The oil crisis was in 73, so not too hard to see a link there. And the plot of that movie is about unlimited energy, which is a sort of a wish fulfillment for what was going on in the world at that time. We're going to shunt a little bit forward. We're going to move into the Timothy Dalton era, The Living Daylights. Obviously here the Soviet Union is back to the forefront of being an aggressor. And a large section of that plot is about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And James Bond actually helps the Afghan Mujahideen in the movies, and this is obviously a nod to the real-world Western support for anti-Soviet forces, such as our friends the Mujahideen. Now, fun fact, there was an attempt to build a Mujahideen cinematic universe at the time. Yes, they're not just here, they're also in Rambo 3, where, hilariously, they're thanked for their tireless support. Now, of course, that would never come back to bite them in the arse. Actually, hang on a sec. Mujahideen cinematic universe. It's very clunky. Oh, that's perfect. Now, eagle-eyed viewers may spot the unhappiest of campers here in the background. Oh yes, there he is. Maybe he thought he'd have a bigger role. Who knows? Now, it wasn't just the Soviets that got in on the act. Other countries too became the bad guys for Mr. James Bond to tangle with. Some of them are very subtle, some of them are not so subtle. Thunderball, 1965. That's about stolen nuclear warheads. Now, the Cuban Missile Crisis was going on around the same time. The Cubans aren't the bad guys in that movie, but it's pretty obvious that the mechanisms around that are in place here. And of course, Cuba will be name-checked a few more times in James Bond movies going forward, never for good reasons. I mentioned You Only Live Twice, that includes Japan. Japan was obviously the supreme bad guy at some point. We have Pearl Harbor, World War II, all that sort of stuff. They're still operating here in a type of bad guy role. They're not fully invested in this giant volcano, but there is Japanese officials running around here somewhere, so they must have some sort of investment. Now, of course, the main culprits in You Only Live Twice are, of course, the Chinese, who are lurking in the background. Always lurking. And they're going to be a little bit more to the front in Tomorrow Never Dies, where we have a rogue Chinese general, and he's working with the media mogul Elliot Carver. And they're working on the usual disinformation, media manipulation, all that sort of stuff. And they're trying to provoke a war. And Tomorrow Never Dies came out in 1997, and that was at the height of this sort of technological transition period. As I said, media disinformation, media overreach, all that sort of techno vibe, techno thriller stuff. And that's going to become much more prevalent as the James Bond series goes on. Now, we got to them eventually. Everyone's favourite bad guys, North Koreans. Well, they're in Die Another Day, much further along in the timeline. You're talking 2002 now. Probably one of the worst James Bond movies ever. That doesn't matter, it's not the point of this video. My point is to show that North Korea does exist, and of course, you can't have one bad guy without another. Cuba, welcome back. Actually, this time it's their fault. We can blame their free healthcare for this. Now, there are some other bad guy countries mentioned. We have the Nazis, obviously, so that's Germany. The French, supreme bad guys. The French are the world's greatest villains. They have to be put in here.
But there's the handball by Henri.
And by the way, not just once, George, but twice.
Obviously, as well, whatever's gone on with the US State Department at any given second, that has to go into James Bond movie. All their coups, successful, mostly unsuccessful, they're all mentioned in the movies, both indirectly and directly. Personal favourite of mine, License to Kill, and that came out during the height of the drug war America was engaging with in South America. And sometimes Bond travels to that region, sometimes he travels to fictional South American countries. Again, it's pretty obvious which countries they're talking about, and it's pretty obvious that it's the Colombian drug war that they're on about. Now, I'm not going to harp on about every single James Bond movie reference to a bad guy nation. I'll pop them up on the screen there in case I miss any, okay? I'm just trying to say it does reflect real world events. And even GoldenEye, which came out in 1995, that does address the fall of the Soviet Union. And very importantly, and I really wish they had done it more, but it focuses on the role of a British secret agent post-Cold War. And I think there's some great insight there because for most of his life and movie series, James Bond was fighting during the Cold War. And now that the Cold War is over, well, where does he fit into this new world? And I think the relaunch of the James Bond series with Pierce Brosnan, that does reflect that to some extent. I just wish they had done it a little bit more. And as the Pierce Brosnan movies move on, we see James Bond suddenly emerge into a post-9/11 world. And by that point, a lot had changed for the British Empire, her Secret Service, her army, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq. Major repercussions, major egg on people's faces. None of that was mentioned in the Pierce Brosnan movies. They never touched it with a barge pole. In fairness to them, Pierce Brosnan's last movie came out in 2002, so the war in Iraq, war in Afghanistan, post 9/11, it really had only been a couple of months, a year, and then James Bond series just died, went away, relaunched again in 2006 when Daniel Craig came. And I do think with him, there is a sort of a self-reflection by both the US and the UK on both past and present foreign policies, particularly when it came to Iraq and Afghanistan, and in some respects, Ireland. But that would come much later, 2012 Skyfall. And even then, it's still in a very sort of a negative light. And again, we're only mentioned in relation to the IRA. And as I mentioned before, Daniel Craig eventually took over because, well, this post 9/11 world, it's no place for Mr. Pierce Brosnan's quippy, campy Bonds. And I think we needed a more reflective, a more blunt instrument in our James Bond, and that's where Daniel Craig comes in, reimagined as this particular blunt instrument. And I think he does fit in better into a more precarious world that British spies found themselves in post 9/11. And there does seem to be this trend in the James Bond series that when things get really messy in the real world, and when superpowers like the UK or America have egg on their face, well, it's best just not to mention that at all. And that's going to become very relevant when we get to Ireland eventually. And this change of attitude does lead to this Daniel Craig James Bond character being sort of infused with a more real world worldliness in a sense. It's a far more complex and precarious world, and he does fit into that mold much better. I do think it's a much more realistic take on what a James Bond character would look like in the modern world. But the question still remains, what would any type of a James Bond character, modern or past, look like if they went to Ireland? So we have the real life geopolitical locations, and of course there are the aliases and the fake counterparts in the movies, but when it comes to Ireland, there's no actual parallel whatsoever because it very much exists as something you can't parallel. And for the United Kingdom, there hasn't really been anything like Ireland or the IRA for them. And if they did try and do a Spectre situation with the Soviets in relation to the IRA, I think it would still be insensitive and it would be very obvious who they were talking about. It still didn't stop them doing Spectre and rogue agents in the KGB for the Soviets. So why would they care so much if they did the same thing to the Irish? Well, a simple fact. And that simple fact is anywhere between 12 and 50 miles, because that's all the distance someone from the IRA would have to travel to get back at anyone who dared hold up the fight for Irish independence as being villainous in a James Bond movie. Now, was it that bad, I hear you ask? I'm sure a lot of people have heard about the little wars between Britain and Ireland, but was it so bad that an entire movie franchise would delete the Irish from existence? Well, the simple answer, yes, it was very bad.
We must protect ourselves.
The situation between Ireland and England is very complex, and it stretches back much further than the timeline of the James Bond movies. However, I will say that the 20th century was probably the worst time for the UK in terms of chickens coming home to roost. And here we have several colonies now seceding from the Union. And that of course was prompted in part by Ireland deciding to have a go first. And we do see in the mid 20th century that for the first time the fight was now being taken into the heart of the empire, rather than native countries being subjected to a one-sided affair. And like America on September the 11th, the rubber band of colonial overreach had fully snapped back now. And just like that, things would never be the same again. To provide a comprehensive history of the James Bond films along with the political context in Ireland as well as the IRA's activities during each era, it's essential to understand that the Troubles in Northern Ireland is a very complex thing, and this video will never do it justice. And of course, that's not its aim. Its aim is simply to show you what was going on in Ireland next door to the UK, while the James Bond film series was filming and being released. Now, it might come as no surprise to anyone that Ireland and England have always had a precarious relationship. In fact, the years when the times have been good and relatively peaceful are very, very small compared to the overall timeline of tensions over the last 1,000 years. Many of which also include the more obvious socio-economic ones that came with not only being a colony of a larger empire, but a colony that was subjected to a dark and genocide-centric history. And this relationship between the two countries is especially significant given that MI5 and MI6 and any other intelligence agencies that James Bond is connected to would have been fairly on alert, especially during the 1970s and the 1980s. And yet, according to the movies where these intelligence agencies operate, they weren't on alert, and there was no relationship between the two countries. Now, back in the real world, they were on alert because of the IRA. And it was during this time that the IRA's emergence as a global force to be reckoned with first came about. And of course, it's one of the most well-known paramilitary organizations in modern history. And it emerged onto the world stage to not only consolidate power, but influence as well. And we can see that the timeline of our video, the 1960s to the 1990s, was a very important time for the IRA in consolidating that power and in making a name for themselves. Now, this period from the 1960s to the 90s is obviously the Cold War period, but it also matches up quite nicely with the Troubles in the north of Ireland, which, give or take a few years, was 1969 right up until the peace process in the mid to late 90s. And it's during this period of time that I'm going to focus on for this video. Now, this particular struggle split the IRA into two factions. So you had the official IRA, the Michael Collins era, probably the IRA most people know about, and that just leaned more towards political activism. And then you have the provisional IRA that I'm going to focus on in this video. And they were heavily involved in armed campaigns, bombings, assassinations, and guerrilla attacks against British forces both in the north of Ireland and then eventually abroad in England itself. Now, this IRA was the one that gained international notoriety. And we can see here that they just appear in different countries around the world. We have Gaddafi there in Libya, we have the PLO, and then in the 1980s we see the IRA suddenly appear in the Basque region with ETA, and then we're found in Colombia with FARC. And it's through this international IRA organization that we must view the James Bond film series, and we can kind of overlay it over the movies from the 1960s right up until the present Daniel Craig movies. The main thing to take away from all of this is that the IRA were by no means secretive. They were very well known, and as we saw there, they start popping up all over the world. And their cause and their means and objectives were also known around the world, which, again, makes their absence in the James Bond universe somewhat baffling. Now, as we will get to later on in the video, it's completely necessary and completely correct not to have them in the James Bond movies. But they do get preferential treatment that the Soviet Union did not get, or other bad guy countries did not get. And I'll get into the reasons for that much later in the video. Another thing which makes the situation much more complex is the south of Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and its relationship with the UK made that situation much more complex. And especially after the 1970s and the 1980s, when the IRA decided to set their sights on England and start bombing it. But outside of the UK, Ireland had a very particular and somewhat unusual relationship with the north of its country. We did acknowledge it, obviously, and you have people like Jack Lynch, and they famously couldn't intervene too much, but they did provide aid to Catholics in the north. Later governments, we have Charles Haughey, Albert Reynolds, and they both played their roles in brokering peace talks, and obviously that would lead to the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. But more or less, public sentiment towards the IRA and the situation in the north was very mixed down south. There was obviously early sympathy with the Troubles and the civil rights movement up the north, but when the IRA started bombing Manchester, London, and then obviously you had the Dublin and the Monaghan bombings, when all that happened, there was a bit of a drop-off then in terms of support, and a much bigger drop-off in terms of understanding. So I think it's just best we just go through the movies that were coming out, let's have a look at the north of Ireland, let's see what's going on at the same time. And more importantly, let's see why it was not good to mention Ireland or the IRA in the James Bond movies. So we're going to just break down the eras in terms of the Bonds, and the first Bond is obviously Sean Connery. Now, the Sean Connery era, very fascinating because Dr. No came out in 1962, and although we had some tensions in the north of Ireland, and although there was these sort of failed border campaigns, there was still this sort of powder keg tension around the place. It was going to explode at any moment, we just didn't know when. Now, quite fittingly, it actually changed when James Bond himself changed. So when George Lazenby came in as James Bond, that's 1969, and that's on Her Majesty's Secret Service. And that coincided slap bang in the start of the Troubles. The movie actually came out in December of that year, the same year as the Battle of the Bogside, and that was the beginning of this large-scale violence in the north of Ireland. Now, British troops had already been deployed. They just decided to shoot up the place during this movie's run.
This never happened to the other fella.
And it's very interesting to see that the plot of On Her Majesty's Secret Service has obviously nothing to do with anything in the north. And quite right, they both just sort of come out around the same time. You don't really get into the sort of weirdness about Ireland and the IRA and all that sort of stuff not been mentioned until the Roger Moore era, and that coincides in the 70s. But before we get there, we do have one more time for Sean Connery to come out of retirement as James Bond. Now, the Troubles were in full swing at this point during Diamonds Are Forever, and we have the full emergence of the Provisional IRA. Again though, the movies have no mention or allusion to anything going on across the water. And what was going on across the water was pretty intense. Now, we obviously had sporadic unrest leading up to it, but by this point we had a full-scale conflict, and there was bombings, internment without trial, all sorts of assassinations, tit-for-tat killings, and yet amidst all that chaos, James Bond was out there somewhere else, calmly saving the world, martini in hand, but not in Ireland. The producers of the James Bond film series did have a secret weapon up their sleeve though, to try to deal with the Irish situation, and what they did was decide that the semi-serious, gritty Sean Connery James Bond, well, he'd have to step aside now. And what they replaced him with was something the IRA could never defeat: British humour.
Up the Ra.
And of course, there's no more funnier a James Bond than Mr. Roger Moore, and his era was 73 to 1985. And this was a very significant time to be alive in Britain, if you weren't in the James Bond movie. And it was almost as if James Bond had a new mission, not just to defeat these madcap villains, but to remind the audiences that Britain, despite all the turmoil going on around it, could still laugh. And so, in an era where the IRA's attacks were making global headlines, 007 decided, you know what, I'm off to space. Or I'm going to go off to India and make fun of those people. Or I'm going to just involve myself in a blaxploitation movie. Now, in a world grown darker by the day, it probably was the best way to fight back. And it wasn't with brute force, but with a well-timed quip. But if we just, come back to Earth for a bit, during Moore's tenure, that's the worst bloody time for what's going on. I mean, just take a look at this. Every single thing that was going on from the early 70s right up until the mid 1980s. It was mental. And look, I get it. It's not hard to see why they just went more outlandish, more fantasy, more camp. And they just decided to go more in on the Soviet Union because they were the bigger superpower, they were the bigger threat. Although, as you'll watch this video, they don't seem to be the bigger threat really when you take into account what the IRA was doing, not only in this country, but to the UK. I mean, look at these news reports. Look at all the chaos and the carnage that's going on. Again, I get it. I get why the producers of James Bond were like, we're not going to mention this. Do not mention any of this. Now, there was obviously some very high profile assassination attempts, some very successful, Obviously we have Mountbatten. That was a huge pivotal moment in the IRA's attack on the British government and the British establishment. We also have British soldiers dying in the north, and here's a long list of the different types of assassination that the IRA carried out, including all the other skirmishes, bombings, anything else that they got involved in. And it just shows that the violence that the IRA were engaging in was just escalating more and more and more. And it was pretty obvious to everyone that it was eventually going to spill over into England itself. It's a very complex topic. I touched upon the sympathetic nature of the Irish struggle for independence, and the hunger strikers was a massive part of that. And you have Northern Ireland's Maze Prison, Bobby Sands, very famous hunger striker. I mean, he was even elected to the British Parliament while he was on prison, and he died on a hunger strike trying to spotlight the plight of the Irish in the north during this time. And his death just sparked more violence. And the movie that came out during this time, quite fittingly or ironically, For Your Eyes Only, presumably those eyes looking elsewhere. The British government maintained this very hardline approach towards the north, and the political process at the time were just like, maybe it's done. Maybe we shouldn't even bother anymore. You had nationalists, unionists, loyalists, all of them refused to compromise. When the IRA hit someone, the loyalists just hit even harder, and then the British government hit even harder. You had attempts on the life of Margaret Thatcher, that just escalated things even more. And if you thought Margaret Thatcher hated the people in the north of her own country, well, she really hated the people in the north of Ireland. Now, the assassination attempt on her life, that was huge, and I really don't know what my country would look like if that had succeeded. And it's very hard. I mean, I can't stress how close they came to killing her. Again, during this time, we have A View to a Kill, which is about Nazis and cloning. And of course, that's probably best for everyone, because what kind of a James Bond plot could you do with all that stuff going on? Now, there's not many places James Bond won't visit, but I'm sure he took one look at the north of Ireland and said, not there. And by the time we get to Timothy Dalton in the late 1980s, things did not improve. And as cinema evolved, so too did the IRA. Now we have much more bigger bombing campaigns. Now we have it starting to escalate out into England itself. At this time, very famous, we have the Gibraltar Tree, and that's when IRA members were killed by the British SAS during a planned bombing operation. Now, very interesting. The opening scene of Living Daylights is set in Gibraltar. This happened in 1988. Now that was a year after the Living Daylights, but you do wonder, did the IRA watch the movie and think to themselves, that's actually a really good idea, let's do that. Now, do I think the reverse would happen? Had the Gibraltar Tree attack occurred before Living Daylights, I don't think the beginning of that movie would be the exact same. I think they'd have to change that completely. It's very, very close. But apart from that, I mean, look, here's a long laundry list of everything the IRA did during the Timothy Dalton era, and even just a few years after, before we get Pierce Brosnan. Early 1990s, there was a bigger focus, bigger targets. Obviously, London was a massive target at the time. 1992, just outside the Baltic Exchange. Not long after, you have another truck bomb going off at Bishopsgate. So it just became this regular occurrence, and it just kept reminding the British public that across the water, there's a war going on. And there was this sort of, violent plea to stop ignoring us. And it's quite interesting that the James Bond movies were also doing this type of ignoring as well. And by the time you get to Pierce Brosnan in 1995 with GoldenEye, I think a lot of people are very curious, because now we have an Irish actor portraying a British secret agent. And maybe a lens will be finally shown on Ireland and the IRA. But that never happened, and then what we end up with then is a British secret agent who does not engage with the violence in the north of Ireland at all. And indeed, he never encounters the IRA in any single form, or in any other country. And Brosnan was only Bond for 1 year when the IRA struck again. And you have a huge bomb gone off in Canary Wharf. And it caused detrimental damage. It killed 2 people and injured much, much more. And not only that, it ended a 17-month ceasefire at the time. And I think it just underscored perfectly that things can change at any moment. Now, the United Kingdom, in terms of the British Empire. It's obviously very touchy over portraying former colonies in any way. I hesitate to use the words dirty secret, but in many ways it's a sort of a relic of the past that they still have to deal with. And rightly so. I mean, it is their mess, not just here, but elsewhere. And when we get to James Bond movies, that relationship with its past is very muddled. Now, unless it's a caricature like an Octopussy, or non-existent like Palestine, Ireland, Australia, or glossed over like the south of Africa. I mean, poor Africa. I mean, it only really gets mentioned in relation to diamond mining and arms struggles. Now, not to be flippant, but I wonder who caused that. So, apart from the obvious reasons of not mentioning the war in James Bond or the Irish, there's also this other element which shadows it and which has to do with colonialism and the British Empire. And of course this shame and regret over that history, especially when it comes to places like Africa. The scramble for Africa. I mean, who wants to mention that at all in a heroic James Bond movie who is on Her Majesty's Secret Service? A secret service that is beholden to the Empire. Now, as I said many times, Ireland still makes no appearance in the James Bond movies of the Daniel Craig run. Mallory, or M, is mentioned as being held hostage by the IRA in a sort of a throwaway line. It has nothing to do with the plot, it just adds to Mallory's character, somehow. So yeah, that's the only time that the Ireland or the north of Ireland is mentioned, and it's in relation to holding people hostage. So very ham-fisted, And of course, that was 2012. You could do it at that time. I don't think if you mentioned that Roger Moore's James Bond went missing for a few months because he was held hostage in the north, I don't think that would have went down as well. And by the time Daniel Craig became James Bond, as I mentioned, the IRA disarmed in 2005. And throughout Daniel Craig's run, there was no more violence against Britain from the IRA. There's obviously still things going on in the north of Ireland, but not enough to ever escape its borders and bother England. And there was this sense anyway that by the time we get to the late 2010s, countries have their own problems going on now. We had post-global recession. In terms of the UK, they had Brexit in 2014, successive Tory nonsense after that. They didn't need the Irish to fuck up their own country at that point. And to be honest with you, it was very strange to even mention Ireland in Skyfall. I remember when I first heard it, I was like, oh my god, what the hell? It's like you're, now this is not something I have experience in, but like when you hear your mistress's name in public and you're kind of saying to yourself, oh, they're suddenly real. And Ireland and the IRA suddenly became real. But it was this sort of like slap in the face because you're kind of thinking, well, where were we before that? Did we just not exist? Obviously the IRA existed, but ham-fistedly thrown us in there. I don't know, like it kind of, to me it just made light of the situation. It's like there was so much there that just sort of a throwaway line, it was almost insulting. I don't know, it was very, very, very weird. I mean, I wonder does anyone else have the same feeling when they heard it? And this strange decision to not mention Ireland beforehand, it was necessary, I do think. And it does seem to be a conscious decision by the James Bond producers, especially given that many Hollywood movies that come out during the same period, pre-1990s, post-1990s, they did put the IRA in their movies. Sometimes to glorify them, most of the times to vilify them, but there was always some sort of a sympathy there because it was always coached by this Irish struggle for independence, which was a much more sort of a nice way of saying, hey, look, it's because of that the IRA are doing it. Wasn't always because of that. And from the point of view of the James Bond movies, you now have this voiceless group suddenly been given a voice on the big screen. And these portrayals of the IRA in these movies do make the cause for Irish independence this global phenomenon. And it does make it doubly difficult then for the James Bond producers to ever engage with the Irish or the IRA in any meaningful and tactful way past just a throwaway line. And that's because there's different shades of depictions of the IRA throughout its Hollywood history. And apart from the obvious Michael Collins in 1996, we also have Patriot Games in 1992, The Devil's Zone in 1997. We also have other movies, Wind That Shakes the Barley 2006, Hunger in 2008. They all portray the IRA in different shades. And that's because they're all portrayed at different time points when the IRA were different groups. Some of these movies romanticize the IRA Republican hero, some of them don't. Another less obvious reason as to why Ireland is missing from these movies during the period of the Troubles is Ian Fleming himself. And for those who do not know, Ian Fleming is a former naval intelligence officer, not unlike James Bond. And if you don't know, former naval intelligence officers, and indeed British spies, well, they don't like Ireland too much, and I wonder why. So yeah, look, I mean, you kind of get the sense that he just didn't want us included in anything really. Not in a good light anyway, brass leprechauns, etc. And with all the stuff going on in the north, and then you have the IRA bombing campaigns, the Bond producers, you know, with the memo from Fleming probably from before that, just said, you know what, Ireland? What the hell is that? Do not deal with them at all. So yeah, they just didn't bother. And it's a muddled mess from the start anyway, and it's one which does not bear expounding upon further by flinging the Irish back into a series they had no business ever being in the first place. And on that point, I don't think there's a very good time to ever throw us back in anyway. The situation in the north is still very touchy, and as I said, you know, peace has happened, but reconciliation is a long winding road, and that doesn't happen so easily. And tempers can be reignited, wounds reopened, and all because of some stupid James Bond plot they didn't really think through, and they don't really have enough time to, you know, properly explain all the nuance around the issue. In fact, I would go as far as to say that there's no good time to do a James Bond plot centered around Ireland and the IRA. And even in this post-Good Friday Agreement world, I don't think it's good, as it does imply that there was a dark history beforehand and a dark time beforehand. And that dark history involves the UK, so automatically the British Secret Service would be the bad guys back then, and James Bond as an extension of that would be complicit. And then you have to marry that to the idea of, well, how does the south of Ireland fit into the whole situation? Presumably they would also have to be in a James Bond movie, and then they would also be complicit to some extent in how they treated Catholics up the north. Because the viewpoints of a lot of Catholics in the north of Ireland is that they were left behind by the Republic of Ireland. So now you're going to do a movie where they're suddenly visible and suddenly seen, and then in the context of a James Bond movie, are they going to be saved then? Like, they weren't saved beforehand. And then by extension of that, you have to admit then that you did ignore beforehand and you didn't see it beforehand. And then you get into the more muddled mess of, well, the troubles in the north are not in the James Bond movie because presumably James Bond would be heavily embedded there. And then as an extension of that, James Bond would be the good guy? Does that mean then that the people in the north would be the bad guy then? You know, it is black and white. Once you start doing the grey or the bit in the middle, that's when you start insulting people. There is evidence in the north of MI5, MI6, the British Army working against Irish citizens, including in their deaths. So I don't see how you can portray James Bond as a good guy when all this stuff has gone on as well. And I don't think you can do a trade-off where you just have, let's just do a rogue IRA agent and he's bitter over what happened in the north. And if you do it that way and you do have an Irish villain in James Bond, how then do we look at colonial overreach on the part of Britain during that time period? You know, there's always this attempt to romanticize non-Western former colonies in the James Bond movies as being over there. They're mysterious, they're kind of caricatures of their actual counterparts. And the implication there, whether direct or not, is that the British Empire was somehow doing them a favour, that it lifted them out of their savagery. But in the case of Ireland, the same lies can't be so easily told, for we are not over there, we are right here, right next to you. In fact, if you take any of the pro-IRA movies or sympathetic IRA movies, and then you introduce James Bond into them, he becomes the villain then. And for the Irish and the Irish Americans, it soon becomes very clear what side he's fighting on. And then the issue just becomes even more confused. Because, like it or not, this country does have a very romantic view of its fight for Irish independence. And we won't have James Bond going up against that.
Here's to you, Pierce, your dream, not mine. And yet the thought, for this you died, has turned life's water into wine.
these the same outsiders who took the corn from our mouths when the potatoes went rotten in the ditches? Are these the same outsiders who took the meat from the tables when we lay in the ditches with the grass juice running green from our mouths?
Take it easy.
Are these the same outsiders who drove us to the coffin ships and scattered us to the four corners of the earth? Are these...
The English are gone, Bull.
Gone! Because I drove them out. Me and my kind. Gone! But not forgotten, Flanagan.
It's tricky. It's always tricky to try and navigate one country's dark past with another's bright future. And doubly so when those two countries have had something of a solid understanding of one another that came from endless talks between not only both sides, but all shades of grey between them. And this includes all the factions, all the splinter groups, all the organisations, who each of them saw the road towards democracy and peace or chaos through different lenses, and all of them viewing the road that they were on as just and necessary. As someone who has studied linguistics, language is very important, and movies often paint very simplistic good versus bad colours on the characters. Of course, there are times when shades of grey do appear, the so-called anti-hero. However, within the James Bond movies, this type of anti-hero has not been broached very well. And I do believe that this anti-hero would need to be broached in an IRA type movie. Whatever you think about the James Bond movies, they are ultimately action movies. There are, of course, dramatic elements in them, but they're not really classed as drama. And what I mean by that is that there isn't enough time in the runtime to deal with the dramatic elements that the North of Ireland raises. And so there isn't enough of a runtime to lay the groundwork for all of the pieces for a James Bond movie that has to deal with Ireland in relation to adversaries. And so these types of movie series, they don't really allow the space to define an opposing force's full reasoning for their goals and objectives. And oftentimes it's just reduced to simplistic means, revenge, it's a country over there that has an issue with us. And when that country becomes Ireland, that sort of simplistic language doesn't really work anymore, and it just becomes insulting. Now, the Soviet Union did have multiple movies to expand upon their good guy, bad guy, contentious, not so contentious role, and these were well informed by their real life relationships that were going on. So people watching the James Bond movies in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, they got it, and they could just see that the backstory was there anyway because they lived through it. But Ireland does not have the same luxury or history in the Bond movies. And so flinging us suddenly into it with no lead up, you don't have enough time then, and it just becomes, as I said, insulting or impossible. Now, of course, you could just do a standard James Bond versus the IRA storyline, good versus evil, but as I noted earlier, would the IRA be seen as bad guys? Which IRA do you use? I mean, you couldn't use the actual ones because that would stir up emotions for people on both sides. And you certainly just couldn't make up an IRA group because they all have the same goal of Irish independence, ultimately. And then as a consequence of that, they'd be seen as somewhat heroic since the Irish are not exactly seen as villainous in today's world, nor was their struggle for Irish independence ever seen as overly villainous anyway. And in that same vein of rogue IRA guy or rogue North of Ireland, you can't have a movie where the south of my country is at odds with the north of it, or a splinter group of its population, and all because a British movie dictates that. And you certainly can't do a Spectre type Irish element to substitute in for the IRA, because it still will be perceived as poking the bear or slightly digging at a country's past. Hey, remember that time you guys had your little independence struggle in the 20th century? Well, we're going to make light of it. Not highlight or spotlight, but make light of it. Because that's the only option you have. You can't have it any other way. Otherwise, James Bond is just the bad guy. As I said, it's tricky, and the producers know this, and they've always known this. And I hope the current producers at Amazon also realize this, and that the changeover in hands does not suddenly give them carte blanche to suddenly dredge up every idea that the Broccolis torpedoed over the years, and for good reason. Movie series are often accused of using simplistic language and terms when defining a country's history. And we see that where the country's character is merely introduced to act as a cheap foil to a heroic protagonist. The Balkans, the Russians, the Chinese, the Middle East. It's a long line of cheap caricatures running off the fumes of actual well-defined historical absolutes, and all of it then distilled down into a 2-hour runtime, where the only person really to come out clean the other end is the heroic protagonist as distinct from the other. Indeed, what is classed as a terrorist is one country's terrorist another's hero. How would a James Bond movie navigate such language when it comes to the IRA? Look at Gaza, look at Israel, look at how Hamas are seen in today's world. There's a definite shift there from what it was, that not every non-Israeli in Palestine is in Hamas, the same way that not everyone living in Ireland is in the IRA. Indeed, how would the IRA be seen through such a brown person's lens? What about the Basque regions? What about the South American left-wing revolutionary groups over the years? Groups which are deemed as terrorist communist groups by the State Department in the US. The world is too murky, the lines are too blurred. The Iraq War wasn't quite the victory for America in hindsight, and even Americans will be hard-pressed to look at themselves in a positive light there anymore. The war on terror and all the media, both fictional and non-fictional, that caused an entire race of people to be vilified even more than they were in the 1980s and the 1990s. Now, they did of course try it with the Irish in the 1990s and other movies, but those movies were cushioned by the soft pillow that is the United States. After all, it's an American hero that has to bring down the IRA, not a British one. And on both occasions, it's Harrison Ford. And that's another soft touch approach. A popular American hero, in many ways some sort of cinematic olive branch. Well, you're gonna have the IRA lose in this one, lads, but don't worry, it's to Indiana Jones. Would people have accepted if the RAF bombed Dublin in the 1990s as a retaliation for the London and Manchester bombings? Because, well, everyone in Ireland is in the IRA, or so the perception was. When you view the Irish situation in relation to perceived threat versus measurable consequences, well, then the war in Iraq and the flattening of Gaza seems rather one-sided. Then both of these regions are perceived to be bad because of media perceptions. But the Irish, on the other hand, not being brown, have a hierarchical privilege, especially in the order of races. For the perception in the world of James Bond is that we simply do not exist and thus cannot be characterized as bad guys due to that same absence. That is the prize for our white privilege. We are different. We are not to be othered, at least not anymore. And it's a prize that we could jealously guard if we want, but it must also be held up as a terrible privilege. That because of that whiteness, we don't have to suffer through being vilified the way the rest of the British Empire's enemies were and still are. And perhaps that is our victory for winning, or maybe it's just our legacy of fear. Fight us as we are, or do not fight us at all. And so, for the producers of the James Bond series, they just chose not to in the end. Two peoples at war for such a long time, it bonded them in a way no two other races or peoples have ever been bonded. Indeed, to even mention Ireland in James Bond would be to legitimize Her Majesty's claim over it at one point. And of course, to legitimize also Her Majesty's gravest mistake. And so the absence of my country then can perhaps be seen as one of supreme respect. An echo of a request this great island once gave the British violently over the last few centuries. And that request, of course, was to be left alone. And so, in the world of the James Bond universe, left alone we were.